shared with us about, what's on your table. Please, get seated. So, Manhattan, we'll start with you, Kach, בבקשה. As you're the visitor, you heard Gil Shved, you heard the mayor of Kiev probably earlier speaking, maybe facing the biggest challenges any of us facing nowadays. Looking at Manhattan, I was in your beautiful city twice this year. Beautiful as always. Nice to see it coming back after COVID, but a bit disturbing seeing, the crime rate and people are afraid of getting to the subway at night and things that are long gone in New York since the 90s or 80s. Suddenly they're back.
Yes. עם רשות שלכם מספר מילים בעברית?
Go for it.
קודם כל אני רוצה להודות למרכז השלטון המקומי על הזדמנות להשתתף באירוע חשוב זה. ובעיקר, וואו, ובעיקר לאח שלי, צביקה ברוט, הוא כמובן ראש העיר בת ים, הוא ממש בעל חזון. תודה על החברות שלך, צביקה. I do want to repeat that part in English for visitors who are here from other parts of the world. You really need to see what's happening on the ground in Bat Yam, which is confronting challenges common to all of us in urban renewal, in public transport, and coastal resiliency, with incredible vision and innovation. So check out Bat Yam. Thank you. Tada. To your question,
Signed Twin Cities
אנחנו גם, סליחה,
Manhattan and Bat
כן,
Yam.
כן, בת ים, עיר תאומה שלנו. They are a twin city and very proud. And yesterday we inaugurated a new park called Manhattan Park in Bat Yam. So, very exciting.
So now on to Manhattan, what's going on in
בת ים,
Manhattan.
נכון? What's that?
Let's move and speak about what's going on in Manhattan.
This is probably the most salient issue in politics and government in New York right now. The question of safety. In part because, unlike in other countries, policing and law enforcement is entirely under the control of the local government, the local budget. So we are accountable, for better or for worse. Now, the big picture is a little more nuanced, because if you look at the statistics since the 1990s, we've had incredible improvements in public safety. We were seeing over 2,000 homicides per year in New York City in the early 90s. This year, it will probably be more like 450. On the other hand, that number has been increasing in recent years. And what you are feeling on the street does reflect greater challenges connected to homelessness and mental health, which are complicated. This is a longer answer than I'm going to give now, but we need to invest in the kinds of social services which will solve the challenges of homelessness and mental health. And we need policing which is effective but also sensitive to the fact that we are a multiracial city that has a history of, at times, unfairly aggressive policing on communities of color. And we have to balance those things to achieve safety and fairness for everybody. That's not so easy to do, but it is really our number one task right now.
Oded Rביבי, thanks for joining us, Mayor of Efrat. Your city has been growing rapidly, bringing all the problems of, a city getting bigger, but your geographical position, in the middle of the West Bank, facing Palestinian cities surrounding you, terror attacks, etc., what challenges does it bring to you?
So, good morning, everybody. It's great to sit next to Mark again, and I'll tell you a secret. It was just last May that Mark and I actually met in New York when we were part of a delegation of mayors from Israel who flew to New York to try and study about urban safety and security. And Tzvika was there with us, and it was fascinating that I came from a city of 15,000 people, thinking I'm coming only to learn and study from the Big Apple. And all of a sudden, I find myself with actually hints and suggestions what the Big Apple can actually learn from a small place like Efrat. So you're absolutely right. The location of Efrat is extremely challenging. We're bordering 3 Arab villages, Wadi Nis, Abdallah Ibrahim, Wadi Rachel. We're bordering the city of Bethlehem. Efrat is not surrounded by a fence, just like New York. And some of the threats that the residents of Efrat have are very similar to threats that residents of New York have. But the residents of Efrat feel much safer. Why? Because we have learned how to provide a surrounding security service that protects the perimeter, that allows us to see if strangers want to come into Efrat. And before this panel, we were discussing the issue of weapons, where Mark is bothered with people coming in from Texas, bringing in weapons to New York. No weapons here. A free zone area from weapons, but he was describing how in New York they declared a free zone area from weapons, and when somebody comes and visits from Texas, is he allowed to come with the weapon that he's carrying legally or not? Now in Efrat I have the same problem, because there are terrorists all around Efrat who want to come into Efrat, and my encouragement to my residents is that the more weapons we have in the streets, the quicker we actually manage to tackle an event that we actually have. And most of the events that we had in Efrat, if not all of them, were actually ended by civilians who were on the area in the
premises.
First responders, but not even first responders. They were the first to respond, but they were just walking around. We also have a first responders volunteer group that they come when we call them, but most incidents we manage to provide the security just by the residents and what we have in our own hands.
So you've mentioned before that you visited, alongside other mayors, the city of New York, the Big Apple, and that you found yourself giving ideas to your hosts. Share with us what you told them.
So one of the examples that really struck me was that in New York, there is this mentality or even vision to keep weapons away from the schools. Why? Because they don't want the kids to be around weapons. In my schools, first of all, we have a guard by law at the entrance to every school that is funded by the Ministry of Education. But we also know that we have teachers in the school who carry on them weapons, and just think about all the incidents that happened in the United States in schools. How long did it take to law enforcement forces to come and respond when we knew that there was a shooter in the school? And if there was somebody in the school itself who could have responded, the casualties would have dropped dramatically. So it's looking at the same threat in a different perspective and maybe changing the views of what we need to do.
So back to you, you know, I think of the problematic thing that Oded just raised. On one hand, you want less and less weapons in the streets because it's dangerous. On the other hand, people need to defend themselves. So the worse the situation gets, the more weapons you'll get on the streets. So you're in a circle that you can't get out of it.
We have a major epidemic of gun violence in America, which is inseparable from the fact that we have at least 200 million weapons in private hands in our country. We are not the only country with mental health challenges. We are not the only country that has people with homicidal fantasies. But we're the only major country with that saturation of weapons in private hands. And it's deadly. It's deadly even in New York. New York State has very restrictive gun laws. But Virginia does not. Ohio does not. And we do not have a national policy. Therefore, people can drive to those states and bring them to New York. I personally believe the solution is not to add more guns into places like schools in the context of America. It's to make it harder for private individuals to get guns without intensive background checks, severe limitations on the kinds of weapons that you can buy. You can currently buy assault rifles in America that have no use outside of a military context. This is a major battleground issue nationally, but we need fewer guns on the streets. I think that law enforcement should have a monopoly over gun ownership in America. This is what we're fighting for in New York.
But what happened in the past few years? Because as I said, you know, beforehand when I raised the first question to you, New York was very, very safe. You know, 2, 5, 10 years ago, you could have gone anywhere. You felt safe, whether it was the suburb or any park in the city. Currently, that's not the situation. What happened? I'm asking because we're facing about the same situation in Israel, where we see a rise in criminal activities and a lack of ability of the police and other enforcement law agencies to tackle that problem. So maybe we can study from your experience or unexperienced, I don't know.
Well, Look, I do want to ground us in the facts. We have a homicide rate in New York of about 4 homicides per 100,000 residents so far this year. That is far below, for example, the homicide rate in Miami, which you might think is a safer city, but is not by most measures. Because the numbers are moving in the wrong direction, we clearly have a problem to fix, no doubt about it. The pandemic has been so disruptive in New York. It hit New York City harder than almost anywhere in the world from a health perspective, from a perspective of economic disruption, mental health impact. No doubt that is connected. We have severe challenges of mental health that are playing out on the street. People who are homeless with conditions like schizophrenia, who are probably the challenges that you experienced when you were in New York. We have to find ways to get them into the housing they need, into the hospitalization that they need. But our city and our state is not invested in those kinds of medical and social service resources.
But still, Mark, I ask you what happened. Why did it change? Why, lack of investment in infrastructure, in people, growth of a population, people immigrating in into New York. What happened? Why did it change?
We changed the way we deal with mental health in America. It used to be we would institutionalize people and kind of lock them away and forget about it, and that turned out to be inhumane. We brought them back to communities without investing in the community mental health structures that are needed to allow people to lead healthy lives. Many of them wound up on the streets, homeless, in crisis. We have underinvested in hospitals. We don't have socialized medicine in America. We don't have Kupat Cholim in America. And the number of psychiatric inpatient beds has been reduced steadily. We lost 500 in Manhattan alone. And therefore, even patients who need psychiatric care often cannot get a bed. They're winding up on the streets. So we have a variety of challenges that have contributed to this crisis coming out of the pandemic. We can solve this. We know how to solve it. Policing is part of the answer, but it's fundamentally a social service, housing, medical care challenge that we also must invest in.
So back to you, Oded. You know, we spoke of terrorism. Obviously, that's your major concern, taking into consideration the place where you're located at. But still, you live in Israel, and we see the crime rate and other problems that I'm sure they are no stranger to Efrat as well.
First of all, you're right. Luckily enough, we don't talk about how many people have been killed. Luckily enough, we're not at that level of crime. The pandemic has definitely raised an issue of a rise in violence within the family, more people disobeying the law, people are more hot-headed. It's definitely seen. I wouldn't describe it as extremist as Mark has described what's happening in New York. And in a way, I think it's also a bit of an excuse, because in Israel, the reason that we have more illegal weapons has nothing to do with mental health. It has because there is a conflict between the Arabs who want to try and control and protect themselves or attack Jews, and by that they purchase weapons, they increase the number of weapons, they solve problems in between them by violence, and that's where we see the rise, the main rise in crime. I think what is true in New York and in Israel, that we see that the old organs that we used to think that were effective are proving to be less effective these days. The police is less effective. And the things that we need to try and think of is how do we make it relevant to this time and era, to the ability of people to have their hands on weapons. Because we realize that to block and prevent people from buying weapons is almost impossible because they steal them from army bases. So we know already where they get it, but we still are not managing to stop it. And therefore, I think that coming with solutions like we've tried in Israel with Hashomer HaChadash, it's an initiative that came from residents, from people who saw that the fields are being burned down, that agricultural products are being stolen, and people just took, I won't say the law into their own hands, but they took the responsibility of protecting their property and created a huge organization of volunteers who are way more effective, way closer to the crimes actually happening, and respond quicker than what the police is actually doing. If the next commissioner of the police or the next minister who will be in charge of the police will understand that he needs to make the police more quick in responding, I think that will be one of the challenges. And back to New York, you asked what changed. When Mayor Giuliani came to his office and saw the levels of crime, he said, I want a policeman at every corner street because I want the police to be seen. That is something that helped for that time. It's not relevant for today, and you need to think like Giuliani back then. What do you do to actually respond to what you see?
Last issue I want to raise with you is what we've touched with Gil Shveid, and we will touch with Julio Shalev, who will take the floor after you. And that's the world of cyber and what technology brings, which are many solutions, but many problems as well. If we stay with you, Oded, for another minute. So, you know, the IDF and the Israeli other defense forces, mainly the Shabak, had to bring technologies in order to protect you, mainly cameras, big data, the ability to analyze things rapidly in order to prevent or if a attack occurs, so to be able to track the attackers, the terrorists, and to reach them. So your experience with technology is very, very good.
So Mark and I were just discussing it before we went on the stage, and Mark said, I hope you don't mind me quoting you, that he hopes Gil paid a lot of money to be on the stage because he's doing a great marketing job for his business. And I said I don't think he should have paid anything because he didn't do any great marketing job for his business. Because what did Gil say? Gil basically frightened us all that every single city needs to buy all these seals and protecting products which are in the market in order to protect their city. Now, I can't invest the same amount of money that New York can invest. Obviously, a city of 15,000 people is nowhere close to a city with 8.5 million people. But what I do know is that whatever I don't have in my possession on a day-to-day basis, I also won't have in case of an emergency. So my computer guy, who is one person in the council, every single day tries and thinks how he can raise the awareness of our small little council to protect ourselves from these attacks. He hears of an attack happening on one of the municipalities. He finds out what did they find as a breakthrough to come into the municipality's database and teaches our people how to protect ourselves. And so far, please, thank God, this has been extremely successful. We go, we try and learn from other cities. We invite attacks in order to drill ourselves. And whatever we don't practice, then we won't know what we have to do when we have to do it.
Mark, on to you. You know, everybody uses the terms current days, safe city, smart city. Everything is safe and smart. We can argue both, whether it's that smart, definitely whether it's that safe, but that's, you know, those are the buzzwords. We even, I believe, an Israeli company, Margalit, with Margalit started, you know, a smart city, safe city in Manhattan, in New York City. So it is no stranger to you, both connections to Israel high-tech society and Israeli high-tech coming to New York on those terms of protecting the city. But how protective is it, and where are you heading to?
Well, New York City has a slightly bigger budget than Efrat. We have a $100 billion city budget, and so we are able to invest in cybersecurity at another level. Even in New York City, we have had breaches. We had a very damaging breach of the city's law department, which might sound obscure, but that's where we have some of the most sensitive documents in city government, personnel files, etc. But you raised an interesting point about the public debate on safety and security versus privacy. And I think in America and in New York, I think we put a premium on privacy perhaps beyond what other societies do. There are new tools, for example, using AI to identify suspects by scanning pictures on social media. And the public is not entirely comfortable with that. The idea that law enforcement would be scanning social media to use AI to match pictures. And so New York City has probably been a little more reticent to embrace some of these tools because we do need to have a more in-depth public conversation. Ultimately, we have to keep people safe, but at least in our country, the civil liberties involved are equally as important. It's got to be a balanced discussion.
So before we sum up, I would have asked you each to recommend something to the other one, apart from visiting each other and, you know, visiting Bat Yam and Tzvika. What would you recommend to each other?
I would strongly recommend putting people's safety above feeling safe. And what Mark is talking about, people protecting their own security by their own privacy, you sometimes have to pay a price in order to gain that security that you'll actually be able to live.
Mark?
Well, I say that healthy societies are safer societies, and that we should think about investments in public health and education and housing as also ultimately about public safety, because when societies fail to invest in those services, ultimately they do pay a price on the public safety side. That's why we need a holistic approach, and local government is best placed to achieve those goals.
So I want to thank you both, Mark and Oded, for sharing your thoughts with us. Enjoy your stay in Bat Yam. Bat Yam received the best PR today, so thank you both.